Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final class. Our topic for today is wealth and poverty in the United States. Before kind of going over our agenda, I just want to say two quick things. One, you can probably notice I'm in a different location. This is my house, or part of my house. My palatial manor in, a tiny little row home in Baltimore. Second thing I want to say is, I pick a lot of controversial topics in this class. You know that by now. This topic is in some ways a little different than the others, which is one of the reasons why I end on it, because in America, I probably in every country, very few people would disagree that like poverty is a bad thing, right? um, Unless you're like a sociopath who hates human beings, I think all of us would agree like poverty is not good, and we wish we could do something about it, right? Whereas like guns and religion versus government, right? Like people like immediately disagree with that. Everyone agrees that like we should not have poverty, and in an ideal world we wouldn't have it. However, of course, people disagree over what to do about it, which is one of the things we're going to be talking about today. I think this is kind of an interesting topic to end the class on. Oh, one more thing too. This class will be a little shorter than our others. Why? Well, because it's the last class, and because at the end, I'll have a kind of like different type of activity than what we've done before in any of other classes. So I'm just spending a little less time in this lecture for that reason. I'm sure none of you will be upset about that, though. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to start with just by, as I said in the email, hopefully you read that. I'm just going to say a few things about the final exam and hopefully head off any questions you may have about that. So we'll do that first. After that, we're going to, as I often do, start with some case studies. These are things that happened within your lifetime, although for most of you, you probably, don't have a very clear memory of these events. So Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement, both of which I think are really interesting case studies around these questions of wealth and poverty. So I kind of want to start with that. And then we're going to talk about the issues of meritocracy, responsibility, and poverty. And then finally, barriers and bird cages. You're like, what does that mean? I'll explain when we get there. And then finally, escaping poverty. And I want to end on that because, again, people have different ideas about how we alleviate and escape and or eradicate poverty. And I think it would be good kind of opportunity to kind of survey some of the various opinions out there and invite you to formulate your own opinion and ideas on this subject. So our first item on the agenda is just a quick review of the exam. I am not going to sit here and read the whole thing to you. I do just want to highlight a few points. Because almost every time I give this exam, I get questions from students. So I'm just going to anticipate some of those questions that you have and answer the most common ones. And then if, after this review, if you look over it and are still unclear on things, you can always email me. And word processing program, answer the prompts for the following 3 sections. Please don't copy or type out the questions, just include the numbers of the items you are answering. That is because one of the sections will ask you to only answer certain questions. I won't grade for grammar, spelling, formatting, or punctuation. Some of you are going to be happy about that. And then this is the 2 more points, and I'm not going to read the rest of the instructions. In all cases, you're expected to only use info from your notes, class lectures, and or talkbacks. However, I would like all answers to be in your own words. To clarify, I only want information dealt with in the course, but I want your writing to reflect your actual voice. Please just don't copy and paste from your notes. So I'm kind of doing 2 things here. One, the way I teach, I expect students to watch the lectures and pay attention to them and write stuff down. And if anything ends up in your answers that wasn't in the lectures, that means you probably Googled it or used AI. Now, you might have some background knowledge, and that's fine. But either way, just to discourage people from cheating, I would like you to answer questions using only information covered in this class. The other side of it is, if you took good notes, this will be pretty easy for you, but I don't want you to just copy and paste your notes. I want you to do some paraphrasing and putting things in your own words. Okay, let's move down now to the actual sections. So section 1, basically, I have 8 of the big ideas from this class. So most of my lectures started out with a big idea. Some had more than one. And I basically pulled those from the slides and put them out here. And then for each, imagine that you are writing responses to explain and defend the big ideas to a friend of yours who doesn't understand what they mean. For each, craft a response of 3 to 4 sentences that identifies at least 3 points which explain, illustrate, or defend what the big idea means. So really, again, this is not an opinion thing. You're just going to explain it. This is what it means. Here's some evidence for that, right? And all of that should, again, come from the lectures. And then for section 2, this one's a little more fun. Imagine that one of your friends is kind of a know-it-all. This won't be hard for some of you to imagine. This friend watches a lot of YouTube videos and reads social media articles about history that give inaccurate or misleading information. And then basically, here are statements from your friend. You're going to choose 5 statements from the list below. For each one you choose, offer at least 3 points. What do you mean by point? Some combination of facts, case studies, informed viewpoints, and or interpretations of key documents or laws. But again, all these have to be from the class. Pushing back on some of your friends' inaccurate opinions. Using your own words, type 3 to 5 sentence, but no longer, paragraph for each, right? So again, you're kind of doing the same thing as before. However, for this section, it says, as you see here, feel free to write in your own voice as if you're actually talking to a friend. Again, I don't want you to just copy and paste your notes. I want you to use your own voice. And some students even get creative. You can use slang. You can, address your friend, give your friend a name, whatever. But you're going to pick any information from any of the lectures to kind of debunk your friend's uninformed views. I think the last section is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to summarize. Basically, you're going to pick one of these isms, right? We looked at 5, kind of 6 isms. These two kind of got lumped in together because they're mirror opposites in a way. Individualism, libertarianism, populism, federalism, mono versus multiculturalism. You're going to pick one of those isms you think is interesting. And then you're basically going to pick 3 things from the class. So choose one American text. Again, if you give a text means, it explains up here. A document, media publication, law, cultural narrative, social construct, historical era, person or group of people. Basically something we looked at in this class that one can better understand by analyzing it via the ism. So say your ism is populism, right? You're going to pick one example of populism in this class and say, here's an example, here's a moment in time, here's a song, whatever. And you're going to explain how populism helps understand this item or case study or whatever. And then you're just going to repeat step 2. However, you must choose a different text from a different class lecture. So for example, if you selected your text from the week we dealt with immigration, you need to choose a text from a different week. And then you're going to again repeat step 2 a third and final time, right? So you're going to put that together in an essay. And again, that essay will be worth 28 points. And then finally, there's an extra credit. I'm not going to read this to you. Optional means optional. Almost every semester, a student asks me, do I have to do the optional extra credit? And I have to suppress my desire to be sarcastic and say, do I need to send you a link to a dictionary definition of the word optional? So you do not have to do this, only if you want to. But, it is recommended, and I really enjoy reading these. So I hope at least a few of you do it. Okay, that's it. If you have any other questions about the exam, please email me. Okay, let's get to our case study, Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. And before we talk about that, we need to set the context a little bit, which is this. So in 2008, kind of starting in 2008 and kind of progressing through several years, actually, the United States, and not just the United States, but the entire kind of global economy, went through a very, very, very significant recession that was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I think it's important that we kind of understand what happened before we look at Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, both of which were responses to the Great Recession. So I think the best way to explain it is just to play a video, because it's kind of a complicated thing that I might mess with the details up. So here's a little video giving you just a broad overview of the kind of immediate catalyst that caused the Great Recession.
From December 2007 to June 2009, the United States suffered an extended economic downturn that came to be known as the Great Recession. It was the worst financial crisis in the U.S. since the Great Depression, leaving an impact on homes and businesses in America and around the world. We'll look at the causes of the recession itself, and its lasting impact. While failures in financial regulation and excessive borrowing by households and Wall Street contributed, the primary cause of the Great Recession was the subprime mortgage crisis. A mortgage is a loan that allows people to buy a house up front. A subprime mortgage is normally issued to borrowers with low credit ratings. And historically, many banks wouldn't even make loans to people with bad credit. In the early 2000s, however, the housing market was booming, so banks began giving subprime mortgages to people even if they had low credit ratings. In other words, lenders, often banks, were loaning money to people who were less likely to be able to pay them back, and charging them more money for those mortgage loans through high interest rates. Now, on the face of it, it doesn't sound like the best deal for the lender or the borrower. But many people took on these subprime mortgages because they stood to make a large profit if their house increased in value. And that seemed like a pretty good bet. Houses had been increasing in value over the past several years. Home ownership had always been central to the American dream, and people who may never have imagined they could own a home saw the possibility in front of them. So, where did things go wrong? In 2007, the housing bubble burst. As demand went down, the prices of homes dropped rapidly. People stopped investing in real estate since it was no longer as profitable. Many people were no longer able to pay off their mortgages or sell their houses, and the banks foreclosed their homes. Since the foreclosed houses were now worth less money, financial institutions lost money too, along with the homeowners. As a result, the housing market failed, banks collapsed, the economy plummeted, and the Great Recession had officially begun. So, what did this mean for the average American? The economic downturn was devastating. Many people and businesses suffered huge financial losses and therefore spent less money, further damaging the economy. Financial firms were not as capable of lending money, and in 2008, the US government finally had to step in and bail out the banks, increasing the national deficit. During the Great Recession, more than 8 million Americans lost their jobs. Nearly 4 million homes were foreclosed each year, and 2.5 million businesses closed. Bank bailouts, federal aid to the auto industry, and government spending programs helped avoid an even bigger crisis. But it may take decades more to fully understand the significance of the Great Recession.
So one thing the video didn't really mention or go into much detail about was the degree to which Wall Street was kind of culpable or responsible really for the subprime mortgage crisis. So a full accounting would be way more detailed than I feel comfortable going into, just because I think it would just get a little boring. The causes of the Great Recession are extremely complex. And honestly, I don't completely understand all of them, so I'm not an economics person. But here's what I do know. For a long time, Wall Street had been basically kind of developing a reputation for some critics said there was like a casino mentality on Wall Street for a decade or more, where various investment firms were creating these increasingly kind of like risky financial instruments and like investment portfolios and stuff that if the economy kind of took a turn, that kind of like it would come kind of crashing down like a house of cards, right? That's kind of what happened. Also, Wall Street banks and whatnot were the ones really kind of like pushing these subprime mortgages and giving them to people that they knew were risky. And then there were other people who were like betting on them failing, and they made a lot of money when they failed. So long story short, Wall Street really came crashing down. There were entire huge banks that failed. And millions and millions and millions of people lost a whole bunch of investment wealth, and some people lost their homes, obviously. And it was just a huge mess, and the economy was tanking. So what did the federal government do? Well, the federal government responded by bailing out the banks. So there was this huge thing. It was called TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. It actually was put together when George W. Bush was president, and it didn't get fully passed until Obama came into office. And you can kind of look over this if you want, but there are various parts of it. But it was roughly $600 or $700 billion. Can't remember how much precisely. And most of that bailout money went to struggling industries, including some of the banks that had really pushed a lot of these risky investments and created this mess in the first place. So there was a lot of anger about this, right? And the first, I think, really noticeable manifestation of this anger was the Occupy Wall Street movement. Occupy was a really brief movement, only lasted a few months, but I think it had a really kind of important and long-lasting impact. So, for example, some people would say that like the Black Lives Matter movement really got a lot of its ideas and a lot of its energy from the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I'm going to pause here and just play a little video about it. So this video came out I think 2021 or 2022 is kind of like a 10-year retrospective after Occupy Wall Street. And it'll kind of explain to you what it was about, and some of its impact. All right, check it out.
Group of activists mad at the 1% and taking aim at Wall Street. Not the great GameStop short squeeze, but Occupy Wall Street, which started 10 years ago. Back then, hundreds of protesters took over Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan and marched to the financial district. The movement would last 59 days, but its ripple effects would stretch for years. Here's CNBC's Leslie Picker.
In the shadows of the financial crisis, between the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan, Occupy Wall Street began. Triggered by a single tweet, September 17th, Wall Street, bring 10. Then came the catchphrase, the fight, the encampment, and the clashes. The fall of 2011, a perfect storm for the Occupy movement. anti-government protests across the Arab world. Stateside, the economy was ravaged, marked by bailouts instead of jail time, and an iPhone in seemingly every pocket. 1 decade ago, it's estimated that 1,000 protesters flooded the streets to rally behind a common enemy, Wall Street.
And the experience in the park was electric. It was like something had burst open in New York City.
We're like a lightning bolt. Like none of us, I don't think, really expected the impact that we had.
The Occupy protests spread to 82 countries in 2011, but without clear demands for what they wanted, the movement fell flat in the eyes of its critics.
These kids downtown, I define them as babies in adult bodies.
At the time, Wall Street didn't take the occupiers seriously, according to Mike Mayo, a bank analyst who attended the protests for research.
This was seen as a fringe group, and the reaction was basically go home, get a job, and take a shower.
After a few months, the movement fizzled out, and in the end, it failed to dismantle the system. 10 years later, the only people occupying Wall Street are more Wall Streeters, the industry adding more than 1 million jobs since 2011. Income inequality, well, that too has widened, the pandemic only exacerbating the divide. But many are now crediting the Occupy spirit as the launching pad for a new wave of left-wing activism in America.
Occupy unleashed a passion and a belief and a sense of courage.
Michael Levitin wrote a recently published book on Occupy Wall Street. He credits the movement for the success of politicians like Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders.
This issue is bigger than any one of us.
And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who recently emblazoned "Tax the Rich" on a dress at the Met Gala. He also says Occupy gave rise to the George Floyd protests, the Women's March, March for Our Lives, and more recently, the Sunrise Movement, a push to address climate change.
Occupy showed the way that people can simply rebel when they've had enough, and to give them courage to do that and to see each other as powerful allies in a movement that's able to actually move the needle.
Sticking it to Wall Street is still in fashion. As you mentioned, Shep, Occupy Wall Street morphed into Wall Street Bets earlier this year. Mom and pop traders banding together to take on the big guy, the hedge funds that were betting for companies like GameStop and AMC to fail. And you know what? This time, the metaphorical 99% won.
Now, the Occupy Wall Street movement, even though it had some really important impacts, as the video told, it didn't really change a lot in terms of how Wall Street worked. It didn't really change a lot in terms of how the federal government worked. So there were no like kind of major legislative victories that came out of it. However, I think one of the really important contributions that Occupy Wall Street made was kind of changing the way, at least for a brief period, for a few years, the way that Americans talked about wealth. And one of the more kind of influential and notable kind of, I guess, rhetorics or kind of, catchphrases that came out was this concept of like the 99% versus the 1%, right? So the 1% being the super wealthy, right? Like the 1% of Americans that hold like vast amounts of America's total wealth versus kind of everybody else, right? Being the 99%. Now, this was obviously kind of like a left-wing response to the anger over the TARP bailout. However, there was also a right-wing response known as the Tea Party movement. So Tea Party, obviously referring to the Boston Tea Party, which I'm assuming most of you know what that is. If you don't, you can Google it. And the Tea Party in colonial America was a revolt against kind of frustrations over British taxation policies and laws and whatnot. So when this kind of like more conservative or right-wing movement kind of started bubbling up again over this anger over bailing out these industries that had kind of screwed people over, they kind of took that name for themselves. And so here's a little video again explaining to you what the Tea Party movement was about. Now, I think in terms of just like hard politics, the Tea Party movement had a much bigger impact than Occupy Wall Street did. So to this day, in Congress, there's these things called caucuses, which is like groups of like-minded senators and representatives that get together to like work on, ideas and issues and policies and things like that. To this day, there's a caucus in House of Representatives called the Tea Party Caucus, right? Which is, a lot of very, very, very conservative, anti-tax, anti-government, Republicans who kind of get together to try to discuss some of these issues. And right off the bat, however, one of the big differences between the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement was that the Tea Party movement was very, very, very well funded. So some people, so you're probably like, what is grassroots or AstroTurf? So a grassroots movement, again, is a movement that kind of comes up naturally from just a bunch of people getting together and trying to push for an agenda, right? Which Occupy Wall Street was definitely a grassroots movement. The Tea Party was kind of a mix of grassroots and what they call AstroTurf, which means so AstroTurf is kind of a negative or a pejorative term from people who are not fans of the movement, who basically pointed out that the Tea Party movement was almost instantly funded by billionaires, right? So yes, even though there were kind of like lots of everyday average, in this case, conservative Americans who were mad about this bailout, there was this larger movement to fund this and make this into these kind of larger political agendas. So for example, Americans for Prosperity is a nonprofit organization that really funded a lot of kind of local small Tea Party, organizations and movements all across the country. And Americans for Prosperity is funded by these two guys. These are the Koch brothers. One of them is now passed away, but their imprint in American politics is still very much being felt. Basically, they're like super ultra billionaires who funded, I guess funded and fund, because one of them's gone, but basically they fund really, really conservative, anti-government, anti-tax, kind of pro-corporate, pro-rich people causes all across the country, right? And there was some pushback from this from kind of left-leaning people, and Koch, again, there was the big mega conglomerates that have all kinds of products, and there's some of the products that they apparently support, and there's this movement to like boycott these products. So when we kind of put them in conversation with each other, right, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party were both movements over kind of anger about things like wealth and poverty, right? Why do these people have so much and we have less, right? Why do these wealthy people get to kind of screw up our economy and then get a bailout for it, right? And this really leads us to the big idea for today, which is this. So on the global stage, the US is the richest nation on the planet and promotes itself as a beacon of opportunity to the world, right? This is why so many people come to this country, right? Tie this into the whole immigration thing that we looked at last time. However, compared to other Western democracies, the US tolerates unprecedented rates of poverty and income inequality. And this is what we're going to look at today and kind of ask, like, why and how and really like how does poverty work in America, right? How does poverty in the richest country in the world work? How do you get out of poverty, and why do some people not? So let's start by just defining some words, because again, meritocracy is probably not a word most of you know, but as soon as I define it, you know what it means, because this is deeply American. So a meritocracy is a society in which individual character, merit, and hard work are naturally rewarded with financial success and upward mobility. Millions and millions of people all over the world, people in the United States, people outside the United States, view this country as a meritocracy, right? All you need is your own talent, your own kind of skill and hard work, and anyone can make it here, right? And if you ask the average American, is America a meritocracy? The average American would probably say yes. That we're going to kind of unpack whether that's true or not, but for now, at least just defining some terms. Next piece of vocab is upward mobility, which refers to a social situation in which an individual, family, or community does better economically than their parents' generation, right? Which again, this is related to meritocracy, right? If you were born into poverty and then move up into the middle class, that's upward mobility, right? And again, very deeply kind of interrelated with the concept of meritocracy, and millions of people try to come to the United States specifically to pursue this goal, right? Income inequality. So now we're kind of getting we've got the wealth side, kind of get the poverty side. Income inequality explores the gap between the richest and the poorest in a society, as well as the cultural and political ramifications of that gap, right? So in other words, income inequality is a relative kind of metric. Income inequality looks at what do like the poorest of the poor kind of make on average, and what do the richest of the rich make on average, and what's kind of the gap between that, right? And as we're going to find out, this is a huge issue in the United States, One that we don't talk about very much, which again is, I think, why the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party are so interesting, is that it was kind of captured a rare moment when we really were talking about kind of the political ramifications of wealth and poverty, right? Last term I want to talk about is social reproduction. So social reproduction has nothing to do with, like, human reproduction. Social reproduction refers to the tendency for societal structures and power relations to reproduce themselves and resist change. So again, when we think of reproduction, we think of, like, biological organisms reproducing themselves, right? Making copies of themselves. Social reproduction is basically kind of like, it's like a sociological theory that says societies often change a lot less than we think they might. And societies kind of naturally tend to try to preserve whatever kind of power structures are already in place and kind of reproduce them. And this relates directly to wealth and poverty. So we have these four concepts, right? Meritocracy, upward mobility, income inequality, and social reproduction. And I think what I want to do is just spend a few minutes on each and just kind of ask the question, what is the state of each of these kind of in contemporary America? And or, like, to what degree do each of these kind of define or kind of capture the kind of real deal, like, what is America really like, right? So of course we have this kind of like narrative, like America is X, Y, and Z, but as we've looked at over and over again, sometimes when you really look at the data and the history, sometimes it doesn't match up with what America says it is. So we're just going to kind of go through one at a time. We'll start with meritocracy. So first, let's start with this concept of meritocracy, right? And I kind of want to ask this as a question: is the U.S. a meritocracy? There are some people would say absolutely, right? And this picture here on the left is really capturing that, right? There are a lot of people who would say, the United States is a place where anyone can make it. All you need is, a good work ethic, maybe like a pretty decent education, and, just keep trying and trying and trying, and eventually you will make it, because America is the land of opportunity and anybody can make it here. Other people disagree, however, and I think this political cartoon is kind of capturing that. So, here again, we see two runners, a white guy and a black woman. Obviously they, look at their tracks. They have different barriers and obstacles to overcome. Here, the guy on the left is kind of saying, what's the matter, right? We have the same distance, but he's kind of ignoring the fact that there are these barriers in her way. Now, to represent the side that would say, yes, the U.S. is a meritocracy, I want to introduce you to somebody. Some of you may have heard of this guy, Chris Gardner. Chris Gardner is a really, really fascinating dude. He grew up poor. He grew up really disadvantaged. He grew up, without a meaningful, like, kind of male role model father presence in his life. Really kind of just like, in a lot of ways, like an unfortunately kind of like typical story that a lot of like poor kids have. And he was actually homeless for a while, homeless with his son, and went from being homeless to being like a major influential trader on Wall Street. Like literally went from the streets to Wall Street by being smart and working hard and making connections with people and, just hustling and hustling and hustling until he made it there, right? And, wrote a best-selling book about it, which got turned into a movie. So in 2006, the movie The Pursuit of Happiness, and yes, that is spelled right. If you watch the movie, they'll explain to you why I spelled the Y, not an I. I think what I want to do, I want to play the trailer for the film, kind of for two reasons. A, because, it gives you a pretty good overview of this man's story. And again, his kind of like, some people call it rags to riches story of going from nothing to being very wealthy and successful. And also just the kind of tone of the trailer, I think really like is a good example of meritocracy rhetoric at work, if that makes sense. So let's check it out.
I met my father for the first time when I was 28 years old. When I had children, my children were going to know who their father was.
Yeah. Chris Gardner was doing his best.
We don't need two.
We don't need one.
Maybe next quarter.
It's possible.
But his best
Wait!
wasn't enough.
Man, I got two questions for you. What do you do and how do you do it?
I'm a stockbroker.
Stockbroker? Oh. Hey, I'm gonna let you hang on to my car for the weekend, but I need it back for Monday.
Feed the meter.
I need the rent. I can't wait anymore. I need you out of here in the morning.
You gotta trust me, all right?
I trust you.
Because I'm getting a better job.
Ooh, child.
Let me see if I can find you an application for our internship.
Did Mom leave because of me?
Mom left because of Mom, and you didn't have anything to do with that. There's no salary.
No.
I was not aware of that. My circumstances have changed some.
Dad, where are we going?
I don't know. Last year, we had an intern score on 90% on the written exam. He wasn't chosen. It's not a simple pass-fail. You're not quitting on us yet, are you?
Don't ever let somebody tell you you can't do something. Not even me. All right?
All right.
Jay says you're pretty determined.
Where are you going? Go to the hospital! I'm in a competitive internship at Dean Witter.
He said you're smart.
Now, on the other hand, some people would say this is the whole concept of a meritocracy is really, 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 really problematic. That even talking about meritocracies, even arguing that America or any society is like purely a place where anyone can make it if they work hard enough, that it kind of denies the fact that some people don't have the same access opportunities as other people. Here's a little video about that. I think we'll kind of break this down and talk about some of the problems from people who would say, well, maybe the United States is not a meritocracy.
Politicians from all walks of life nowadays agree on one thing. We need to build more meritocratic societies. That is, societies where everyone, no matter what their background is, has the chance to succeed on their own merits. This is a beautiful idea, responsible for some great things, like free education for all, positive discrimination, and a real effort to end nepotism in business and government. We've largely done away with the old world of feudalism, where lords couldn't manage their estates, commanders couldn't understand the principles of battle, and peasants were brighter than their masters. No longer is background an impassable obstacle to advancement. An element of justice has finally entered into the distribution of rewards. It's been going on for about 250 years, ever since Napoleon declared that the ranks of the French army and civil service would henceforth be open to all on merit rather than family background. It's been a brilliant development, but there is, importantly, a darker side to the idea of meritocracy. Because if we truly believe that we've created, or could one day create, a world where the successful truly merited all their success, it necessarily follows that we'd have to argue that the failures were exclusively responsible for their failure. In a meritocratic age, an element of justice enters into the distribution of wealth and status, of course, but also of poverty. Low status comes to seem not just regrettable, but also deserved. Succeeding financially without inheritance or contacts in an economic meritocracy gives individuals an element of personal validation that the nobleman of old, who'd been given his money and his castle by his father, had never been able to feel. But at the same time, financial failure has become associated with a sense of shame that the peasant of old, denied all chances in life, had also thankfully been spared. The question of why, if one's in any way good, clever, or able, one is still poor, becomes infinitely more acute and painful for the unsuccessful to have to answer to themselves and other people in a new meritocratic age. There's turned out to be no shortage of people willing to answer the question on behalf of the poor. For a certain constituency, it's clear, and perhaps even scientifically provable, that the poor owe their position to their own stupidity and degeneracy. With the rise of an economic meritocracy, in certain quarters, the poor have moved from being described as unfortunate, the target of the charity and guilt of the paternally minded rich, to being described as failures, fair targets of contempt in the eyes of robust, self-made individuals who are disinclined to feel shamed about their mansions or shed crocodile tears for those whose company they've escaped. In the harsher climate of opinion that can gestate in the fertile corners of meritocratic societies, it's become possible to argue that the social hierarchy rigorously reflects the qualities of the members on every rung of the ladder, and so that conditions are already in place for good people to succeed and the dummies to flounder. attenuating the need for charity, welfare, redistributive measures, or simple compassion. It's a symptom of our great faith in meritocracy that it's largely become impossible to explain away our failures as the result of bad luck. While it's granted that luck maintains a theoretical role in shaping the course of our careers, the evaluation of people proceeds in practical terms as if they could all fairly be held responsible for what happens to them. It would seem duly and even suspiciously modest to ascribe a victory to good luck, and more importantly, it would be pitiable to blame defeat just on bad luck. Winners make their own luck. That's what modern society tells us. It's tough living in a world so in love with the idea that we're all responsible for everything that it's largely dismissed bad luck as a credible explanation for defeat. But, of course, there can never be a truly meritocratic system, because the merit of an individual is far too complex and subtle a thing to be determined by what job you end up having and how much money you end up earning. Those who have faith in meritocracy are essentially subscribing to an insane and certainly arrogant assumption that ordinary humans, employers or customers, can handily take over the solemn responsibilities that past ages more wisely left in the hands of a god who, helped along by the angels, was due to weigh the souls of each person on the day of judgment. No one in this world ever gets exactly what they deserve, in terms both of the good things and the bad things. Life is to a large extent, we don't quite admit to, random, in a way that the meritocratic philosophy denies. To free ourselves from some of the more punishing side effects of a meritocratic worldview, it would be wise to cease investing something as haphazardly distributed as jobs and money with moral connotations. And we should retain a little of the old-fashioned, modest belief in a distinction between what someone earns and what they're like as humans.
So let's look now at this question of upward mobility, right? Clearly in America, there are some people who move up the social ladder, right? Move up economically, maybe start poor and end up middle class by the time they die, right? But how common is that? And also, is the United States this beacon of upward mobility that we say we are? And I want to answer that question by looking at some data from the World Economic Forum, which is like a kind of like a global, what they call NGO, non-government organization, or not nonprofit as we call it in America, who compiles and analyzes economic indicator data from all over the world and periodically puts reports out. So this report is from a few years ago, but I think it's still relatively, it's recent enough. So let's look now at their definition of mobility. So social mobility dictates whether children are on the path to have a better life than their parents, or if they will remain tethered to their socioeconomic status. And again, they use these 5 indicators: healthcare, education, tech, access, work opportunities, and social protection. And they use these 5 indicators to determine, to what degree various countries around the globe kind of support or foster economic, social, and upward mobility. And here is what they found. The United States is, can you find the United States on here? It is number 27th out of the top 41 countries. Not that great. Look at some of the countries in the top slots: Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden. Man, those Northern Europeans really got something good going on. As far as I know, these countries are not like advertising themselves to the world saying, hey, move here, we have this upward mobility. Okay, here's some more data. This is a fascinating chart. Let's focus on the right side. The left side, we're not really going to look at. So this is showing kind of the gap between perception versus reality of social mobility in 5 countries, including the United States. Took me way too long to say 5 there. Okay, the blue is showing actual levels of mobility and red is showing perceived. And this is not just mobility in general. This is specifically showing basically, so don't worry, quintile, don't worry about all that stuff. Basically it's showing like what is the likelihood of someone kind of moving from like the poorest income bracket to like a very, very, very high earning income bracket. So the red is like opinion polling data and the blue is the actual data. So in the United States, a very poor person has roughly a 7.6% chance of moving from the lowest income bracket to a high income, the very highest income bracket. Whereas Americans believe or perceive the likelihood of that happening much higher, right? And then in Britain, France, Italy, and Sweden, it's reversed. There's actually like a lower perception of the likelihood in terms of, the average British or French person or whatever, versus a much higher actual real life likelihood. And again, in every case, at least for these 5 countries, the United States has a much, 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 much lower chance of moving from the lowest to the highest income bracket than these other countries. Now, why does the United States have less social mobility? Or maybe a better question is, these countries at the top that have really high social mobility, what are some things that they have that we don't? And I just want to warn you, like, I try to be kind of politically neutral. I know I don't do a good job all the time, but, you know, I might kind of present some things that some of you are going to disagree with, and that's fine. But again, based on my research, this is what I think the data shows. One of the major differences between the United States and some of these Northern European countries that have very high rates of social mobility is the social safety net, right? Social spending. So this is spending on, you know, welfare, Social Security, education, things like that. The United States is right down here. So virtually all of the countries that have higher social mobility than the United States just spend more public money on things like education, you know, welfare, job training, anti-poverty programs. The United States, when you compare us to other countries that are similar to us, you know, kind of like Western, you know, style democracies, etc., we just don't spend the amount of money that other countries do. Additionally, the United States is the only highly developed country that doesn't have universal health care. And I think, again, this is both kind of adding to some of the reasons, but also illustrating the previous slide. So when people say the United States spends less money on social programs than other countries, this is one example of it, right? And kind of last point, virtually all of the countries that have really strong social spending and really strong upward mobility also have really, really high tax rates. So even though a lot of Americans, I think most Americans would say we're taxed too highly, maybe that's true. But what is also true is that the countries that have the highest upward mobility also have really high tax rates, and they use those taxes fund anti-poverty programs, fund healthcare. Look at Denmark's tax rate above 50%. You know, imagine running on a campaign to raise tax rate to 50%. 0 people would vote for you in America, right? But again, this is one of the goals of this class is to kind of ask, like, what is it? What is America? Like, why is America different from other countries? And I think this is one of the ways that we are. Okay, let's look at income inequality. So again, this is the gap between the richest and the poorest people in America. And how does America fare in terms of income inequality kind of globally? Okay, so this data is from 2020, so it is current. The US has the highest level of income inequality among G7 countries. If you don't know what G7 is, you can Google it, but you can see the ones listed. You know, these are, again, kind of like wealthy capitalist democracies, and the US has the highest income inequality kind of out of all of the kind of wealthy nations in the world, right? And is a problem that has been growing. So in other words, you know, so this is showing average incomes for Americans kind of over a period of, what's this, like 50 years or so. And here we see the bottom 20%, their incomes have hardly gone up at all, gone up and down, but I guess overall trend of up and not much. Whereas the 1%, who we see in the orange, has been going, you know, they've had some dips here and there, but overall they're doing much better than the rest of us. And this is the 0.01%, the top of the 1%, their incomes have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of the gap between what the rest of us are making. And you might be like, well, who cares? Well, in America, you know, the wealthy often drive our politics and often pick our politicians for us. And there are a lot of people who would say that this is like a big problem in a democracy.
Income inequality has always existed in the U.S., but the gap between rich and poor hasn't always been as wide as it is today. Let's take a look at how economic and political forces have changed the share of income held by the whole bottom 50% and just the top 1% of earners. The mid-century was a period of economic stability. The richest 1% earned 13% of all U.S. income, while the bottom half earned 20% of income. In the 1960s, Americans were still riding a post-war job boom. In the 70s, the lowest-paid Americans got a boost from a steadily increasing minimum wage. Sky-high salaries weren't as typical as they are today. The 80s changed everything. Minimum wage stagnated. Factory jobs were automated or outsourced. Ronald Reagan passed huge tax cuts for the richest, and executive pay soared. By the mid-90s, the earnings of the top 1% surpassed everyone in the bottom half altogether. The rich were on a tear, and even financial crashes in the 2000s didn't slow them down. Today, the share of income claimed by those at the very top and those in the bottom half are completely reversed from what they were in the 60s. Other countries don't have such a wide gap between rich and poor. Among economically developed nations, the US is one of the most unequal, according to the Gini Index, which rates places based on how wealth is distributed. The higher the number, the more unequal the country is. The top 1% in the US is primarily made up of men. Women-dominated fields like teaching and waitressing are lower paying. Women are promoted less often than men. They make 82 cents for every dollar that men make. The top tier is also very white. Minority groups face systemic racism that has contributed to gaps in education, housing, and employment opportunities. African Americans make only 78 cents for every dollar white people make. Inequality varies across the U.S. because of regional economics. Large urban areas like New York City are more unequal because they have low-income residents as well as those in tech, finance, and other industries that offer sky-high wages. Whereas the Great Lakes region is more equal because the wage gap there isn't as wide. Race plays a role too. Southern states, which are generally more racially diverse, tend to be more unequal, while pockets of the West that are more white tend to be more equal. Upward social mobility is especially challenging for those at the very bottom. The rich tend to stay rich, and the poor tend to stay poor. So what could be done? Some legislators have proposed putting the brakes on runaway wealth by raising income taxes on top earners. Many states recently increased the minimum wage, and some states are closing education gaps by expanding access to early learning programs. But on a federal level, there's no consensus, and ultimately, closing the gap between rich and poor will require agreement from an increasingly partisan government, as well as societal shifts to combat sexism and racism. Change isn't around the corner, but understanding how we got here in the first place is a good first step.
Lastly, I want to talk about economic social reproduction. So basically, what is this showing? If you are wealthy, or if you are middle class, or if you are poor, according to the data, the vast majority of us will kind of, I guess, like end our lives in the same kind of economic class that we were born into, right? So yes, there is upward mobility in the United States, but for the vast majority of us, if we were born wealthy, we'll die wealthy. If we were born middle class, we'll die middle class. If we were born poor, we will die poor as well. And this is this concept of social reproduction, right? That like, societies kind of inherently and naturally resist change, right? That social structures and power structures inherently don't change that much. And economics and wealth and poverty is one way to kind of demonstrate that or show that, right? And here's just some data showing that. And again, kind of like income inequality has been getting worse. Social mobility has also been getting worse over time in the United States. So this is just showing 1840 to 1980. So what is this showing? So bottom percentile means the poorest. 50th percentile means kind of like the solid middle class, right? Top income percentile is the super wealthy, right? And we don't care about the super wealthy. Let's focus on these two, the poor and the middle class, right? Basically, what this is showing is that over time, and there's other, I'm not showing you all the data in the world, but there's other data showing you that things have also gotten worse, even since 1980. But what we see is the general trend over the 20th century has been fewer and fewer and fewer people have been able to kind of move up the social ladder, right? Which again is why I said this. In general, today in America, you will probably end your life in the socioeconomic strata that you were born into. I'm going to look at a little more data and just kind of look at like raw poverty data, right? So how many people are poor in the United States? So this is based on data from a few years ago. The US Census happens like every 10 years, right? So like 2020 is the most recent census data that we have. And according to that, kind of in this, and again, it's kind of aggregating this data. So this is between 2016 and 2020, there were roughly 42 million Americans living below the poverty line. Now, you might be thinking, well, 13%, I mean, that's not good, but that's not terrible. I mean, there's still, 87% of Americans who are living above the poverty line. That's pretty good, right? Well, not so fast, because we need to talk about the poverty line. So the poverty line is like a metric that the federal government uses to kind of decide legally whether you are kind of poor or not, right? And the poverty line is really, really, really low. So the current federal poverty line guidelines are if you are one person making $13,590 a year, you are considered poor. So if you're one person making $14,000 a year, you are not considered poor, right? So there are millions and millions and millions and millions of Americans who make very little money, but are not considered poor. However, they don't make enough money to survive, right? They work 2 and 3 and 4 jobs and often rely on welfare and food stamps and other assistance programs. So this number is kind of like, yeah, in terms of the official definition of poverty, this number is accurate, but there are millions and millions and millions and millions of Americans who live just above the poverty line, who are 1 or 2, huge medical bills away from like desperate, abject poverty. So long story short, this sort of captures America's poverty problem, but not really. There are way, 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 way more Americans than I think most of us realize, especially if you grew up middle class, especially if you grew up in the suburbs, especially like an affluent suburb, because there are poor suburbs too. I think Americans don't understand how much of an issue poverty is in this country. And again, globally, if you compare the United States to other, kind of like modern capitalist democracies, we don't do so well. So this is showing the top 5 and the bottom 5. We are in the bottom 5. And, this data is a few years old, but poverty has not budged much since 2016. So this is still fairly accurate. And I think the point is, again, the United States has a poverty problem that lots of us are not even thinking about or worrying about. Which brings us to our next section that I'm calling barriers and bird cages. So what do I mean by that? So basically, the bird cages things will make sense when I get to it, but the barriers I think make sense. And before we dig into this, I just kind of want to make like a point. One of my goals today is to kind of make poverty personal for you. This is not just some like abstract issue that doesn't affect real people. This does affect real people. Again, millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of Americans struggle with poverty every second of every day. And I just think it's worthwhile just kind of sitting with that and trying to understand what life is like for poor people. And again, some of you, it's not hard to imagine because again, based on some of your survey data, I know some of you did grow up poor. So for some of you, this is already personal. But I just want to talk a little bit about like why I care about this issue. For 7 years, I was a technology administrator at a Baltimore City public school. It was a charter school, but it was a weird kind of charter school where we were basically funded by charter money, but we continued to run as a neighborhood school. And the school was located in the largest housing project in Baltimore City. It was either the or one of the poorest kind of school district zones in all Baltimore City public schools. So, again, for 7 years, I wasn't teaching. I didn't work directly with kids all the time, but, I got to see poverty up close and really experience it. And, just, again, connect these kind of like abstract economic figures to just like the lives of everyday people that I actually knew and cared about. And then after that, I went from City Springs. I didn't say the name of the school. The name of the school was City Springs Elementary Middle. I went from City Springs to the Patuxent Institution, which is a maximum security prison in Jessup, Maryland. And I was a teacher and then actually moved up to being the school administrator. I did that for about 2.5 years. I'm no longer there for complicated reasons I won't go into. But it was a life-changing experience. And I would say over the course of my time there, I probably, worked with roughly 100 guys. Some of the guys I got to know really well, and virtually every guy I got to know really well grew up poor. And again, if you grow up poor, you have a really, really, really good chance of landing in prison, as we're going to learn. But just in terms of like the personal connection, when you actually get to know poor people and like actually become friends with them and care about them, this issue of poverty takes on a different, it just means more to you. And most middle class people just don't know poor people. So one of my goals today is to kind of just like try to get us kind of feeling empathetic for our fellow Americans who don't have some of the advantages that some of us have. And in order to kind of personalize this a little bit, I'm just going to pause here and play a video. This is a video about some very poor people living in one of the poorest counties in one of the poorest states in the country. And, just sit with it a little bit, listen to their stories, listen to what their lives are like, look at some of the conditions that they have to live in. And just kind of open yourself up to it maybe a little bit. Check it out.
I am a 3rd-generation farmer. My family farmed the soybean and cotton. Things got a little tough, and so I had to get a second job. But is it enough? No. I made the money, not enough money to pay my expense. Basically, I fell behind.
Over the last year, I would say that
I probably only earned like $5,000 to $6,000. I actually had a bank account, but I don't right now. There was so much things needed, it just got in the negatives.
Holmes County has some of the highest rates of unbanked and underbanked households in the country. We are the only bank in Chula, and we have been the only bank there for as long as we can remember.
One of the reasons that a lot of people in Holmes County are still unbanked or underbanked is the lack of jobs.
They need a small dollar loan to make ends meet. There are not many alternatives to payday lenders.
Some people can't wait on a check. It's about basic needs being met.
So these bottles are just a temporary fix to a long-term problem, but it provides immediate relief to people who need gas and heat right now.
There's a lot of people who need help paying their utilities. We wanted to just try to offer any support that we can. I would say the housing condition is, for the most part, deplorable, but without mobile homes, it'll be a lot of homeless people.
We had water damage. Like they said, we had a pipe that was in the wall that was loose. We sometimes keep our oven on. It circulates through the house. We need tighter loans to keep our lights from getting cut off, to get our water from being cut off. Right now, this is all we have.
Until we can start dealing with those issues and making those issues better, predatory lenders will be alive and well.
I did do the car title loan, which was a big mistake because I had a Chrysler and they ended up taking that. As much as you need the money when you borrow it, you got to think of a way to pay them back. I actually have some nice people that is helping me and my family out right now. Truthfully, like, if that family would never took me in, I would probably just be looking for a homeless shelter. We are on food stamps, but it's kind of a struggle because we have a good amount of people in the household, so like we'll end up running out. Even sometimes when you look at your kids and you just want better, it gets frustrating. They don't really know the struggle that I go through financially. What you want to pray about? What you want? People like that is having money issues. That they will overcome that. Like you just pray for anything like that.
Because I'm maxed out at the bank, you go to the secondary lender and you get $2,000 or $3,000 just so you can pay out some other bill. I knew the predatory loan was a bad deal. I had the family to take care of too. Car note, taxes, bank bills. If I was ready to sit down and put a pencil to it, $200,000 worth of bill and stuff that I had to pay in debt to. Now I'm a farm man working, driving the school bus, working, maintenance, janitorial at a school, and just had to pay a little bit at a time, just keep going. Because that's what I've been doing all these years, is hoping for better days. Well, we need just the money now. I believe most folk in this community, if they had the opportunity to make a sustained living, they would.
So after watching that video, I think I want to kind of put this in conversation with another video, a video I'm not going to play for you, a video you've already seen, hopefully. So one of your talkbacks was watch this video, The Invention of Individual Responsibility. It was a much longer video than what I normally assign you, which is one of the reasons why this class is going to be a little shorter. But I think I like putting these two videos together, right? Because again, there's a lot of people that have a lot of opinions about why some people are poor. And sometimes some of those views feel kind of cold and harsh when you actually hear poor people, right? And actually understand what their lives are like. And let me just give you a quick rundown, because I mean, this video is just packed with content, packed with ideas. It really was like a mini lecture kind of in like a 40-minute chunk. And here's just a quick reminder and refresher of some of the ideas the video dealt with. So one of them was this question of responsibility, right? Who is responsible for poverty, right? Is society responsible, or is each individual responsible for their own economic well-being or not? Also went over different theories of poverty, right? And again, it was not comprehensive. There are lots of theories of why we have poverty to begin with, but I think it did a good job of giving kind of an overview of some of the dominant theories throughout American history in particular. And then I talked about this really crucial moment in the 1960s when the federal government started unveiling all these anti-poverty programs, many of which are still with us. And again, whether they're effective or not, I think is really debatable. But certainly we all agree that their poverty is still very much a problem in the United States. So they certainly were not so effective as to eradicate poverty. It also talked about the conservative backlash against anti-poverty programs, a backlash which starts in the 60s and 70s and really kind of continues through today, right? It's one of the kind of core planks really of the conservative movement is this desire to see like welfare programs shrunk and reduced because in the minds of a lot of conservatives, welfare programs keep people in poverty. And actually, there's some truth to that, to be honest. And then also this issue of like family structure, single motherhood, and poverty, right? There is a lot of data that shows that single mothers are much more likely to be in poverty than kind of married women with children or people who are partnered up or whatever. So a lot of issues in there. And I think what I want to do though is kind of like put all these issues together and kind of package them and focus on one of the most kind of like sticky issues in America around poverty, which really is this issue of personal responsibility. So, and I think what I want to do to explore this issue is kind of put it in this context. If you think of an average person who makes it, like a person who does well and gets a decent education and is financially stable versus an average American who does not, right? And you ask why, right? Why did person A make it and person B kind of struggle their whole life? And generally speaking, if you were to ask an average American, most Americans, I think, would kind of put themselves in one of two camps in terms of answering this question. So on one side, we have the social structure camp, right? People who are more kind of prone to talk about things like economics, policy, education, race, class, gender, right? These kind of historic identities that I think inarguably have been used to decide at various times in history who gets resources and who does not. And on the other side, you have kind of like the culture camp, right? These are people, and again, it's generally speaking, the more conservative people who are, I think, more prone to talk about, well, like, if you're poor, what decisions did you make? What are some of your values? Like, what are you doing about it, right? Now, I don't think anyone is completely in one camp or completely in the other. I think all of us maybe kind of draw from both camps. I mean, we all recognize that social structure is an important factor in shaping our behavior, and we all recognize that personal decisions are an important factor in shaping our behavior. But I think what I kind of do is kind of put these together and kind of illustrate this point further, right? So, in America, we have this thing called the American dream, right? And it's very, very deeply related to this question, this idea of meritocracy, right? America is often perceived and promoted as a place where anyone can make it, right? And if we look at people who do make it and people who don't, oftentimes in kind of popular discourse, and again, I think the video did a good job of illustrating this, we'll often say, well, the thing that kind of divides these two camps is values, right? These people worked hard, these people valued marriage instead of just having, kind of endless children with all kinds of random fathers. These people did what they had to do, and look, it paid off. These people, however, on the right, obviously these people are not doing it, right? And the thing that separates these two people kind of in a lot of popular discourse is values, right? And for a lot of Americans, again, the reason why some people make it and some people don't is because the people who make it choose good values and people who don't choose bad values, right? Again, this whole meritocracy thing. But I kind of want to like put these in conversation, right? Because values don't just drop out of the sky, right? Personal decisions don't just fall out of nowhere. Personal decisions, our values, our culture, our outlook on life is shaped by social structure, regardless of whether you are wealthy or poor or middle class or whatever, right? All of us are shaped by our social structure. And I think I want to riff on that a little bit by basically kind of doing like a little thought experiment. So just imagine like an average middle class community versus kind of an average like poor community, right? And maybe you can use one that you know. So maybe we can say like, think of like a really poor community in Baltimore versus like a really wealthy community in like Howard County or Montgomery County or something, right? How is life for these communities different? And in particular, how is life different for these communities in ways that ultimately make it more likely for people in one community to succeed versus people in another community? And I just want to pick kind of a few random things and make some very, 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 very broad generalizations. Again, generalizations never apply to everyone, but you kind of have to make generalizations anytime you're talking about kind of a social phenomenon. So let's proceed with this. So in the average resourced community in America, you have well-funded schools with a wealth of advanced academics and extracurriculars, right? In the average under-resourced community in America, you have, generally speaking, underfunded schools with a dearth, or it's kind of like an absence, right, of advanced academics and extracurriculars. So this is a problem all across the country, right? Generally speaking, the way we fund schools in America is profoundly unequal. And here's just some data to show that. Now, it's hard to make generalizations about kind of nationally, because again, we have 50 states. Every state, because we have this whole federalism thing, has their own kind of scheme for funding schools. But here's just two examples, Virginia and Massachusetts. But basically what this is saying is in at least two states, wealthy communities get more money for their schools than poor communities. Now, why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. The main reason is, though, most states fund their schools using local property taxes, right? So, of course, if you are in a wealthy community where more people own their homes, the property taxes are going to be higher, and there's going to be more property taxes, and there's going to be more money going to the schools, and vice versa for a poor community, right? Now, again, is this generalizable to every state? Yes and no. Like every state has different funding schema, and actually, Maryland is an interesting outlier. Maryland actually has a pretty progressive funding schema that is actually kind of in the process of kind of being retooled, and actually. In Maryland, Baltimore City gets more funding for its schools than most other districts. So again, generally speaking, though, Maryland is an outlier. For the most part, wealthy districts have wealthy schools and poor districts have poor schools. And of course, as we all know, schooling is a major determinant on whether one, becomes middle class or whether one stays poor. So let's keep going with this little kind of compare and contrast thought experiment. Let's look at crime and violence. In the average resource community in America, you have relatively low rates of crime and domestic violence. And then in the under-resourced communities, you have the exact opposite, right? And, of course, you're like, well, duh, I know that. But it's really important, right? Because, exposure to violence, fear of violence, either in the home or outside of the home, right? Again, crime versus domestic violence, both are violence, right? And violence really, really, really negatively impacts human development. It impacts educational attainment, and it's just very, very, very destructive. And here is just some headlines I just grabbed from the internet to capture this. Poor people are more likely to be victims of violent crimes, report says. So this is specifically, there was a group in Chicago, like an anti-poverty, anti-violence group that looked at both national and local data in Chicago. And here's what they found. Americans earning the lowest incomes, less than $10,000 per household, experience rates of violent victimhood that were 206% higher than people with the highest incomes, right? Here's another one. The lower the income, the higher the prevalence for abuse, domestic violence linked to poverty, right? So in other words, if you live in a poor neighborhood, you are much, 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 much more likely to experience violence either out in the streets or in your home. And of course, that has really negative psychological, educational ramifications for people who experience this on a regular basis. Let's look at home ownership. In the average resource community in America, you have high home ownership rates and low levels of homelessness. And then you had the exact opposite, right? In generally speaking, under-resourced and poor communities. In poor communities, you have high rates of rentership, right? So fewer people owning their home, which again, as we all know, owning your home is like one of the major paths in America to kind of like long-term sustainable wealth, right? So if you're in a poor community and you're renting, you're less likely to be building equity over years and years and years you can pass on to your kids. And high levels of homelessness. So I mentioned homelessness briefly when we talked about kind of housing and property and things like that. But I did want to revisit this, right? So here are some numbers for homelessness. This is from 2018. I couldn't find more recent data. I'm not sure why, but still, I think it's recent enough for it to matter. This is listing every county in Maryland. Look at Baltimore City. So in FY's fiscal year, in fiscal year 2018, there were over 12,000 kind of counted homeless people, right? I'm sorry. Here we go. 2018, this is 2017. Roughly, again, a little over 12,000. And, there are other counties with the homeless problem. I mean, Montgomery County actually was weird. Montgomery County is kind of wealthy too. They have a homeless problem. Baltimore County has a homeless problem. But no counties in Maryland have a homeless problem like Baltimore City does. Why? Because there's huge poverty concentration in Baltimore City, and poverty breeds homelessness, and astronomically breeds homelessness in a way that no other county deals with, right? So again, imagine if you're living in an under-resourced community and homelessness is something you deal with on a regular basis, that is going to negatively impact your ability to succeed long-term. Average resource community, ample high-paying careers with benefits. Average under-resourced community, scarce minimum wage jobs with no benefits, and informal economies. So by informal economies, I mean selling drugs, sex work, right? These kind of illegal ways of making money that have been with us for, ever, but really, really, really cluster in poor communities in ways they don't in other communities. And again, I just want to tease out like kind of some of the results of this. If you make less money, you're more likely to live below the poverty line. Let's just compare Baltimore City versus Howard County, right? Again, roughly 23% of people living in Baltimore City live below the poverty line. But again, the poverty line is super low, and you could be making more money than above the poverty line, but still struggle and still not make enough money to support yourself or your family, right? So again, it's just another problem that comes along with poverty. People who struggle with poverty tend to have jobs that do not lift them out of poverty, right? That generally speaking don't have benefits. Generally speaking, they're not unionized. Fast food, working at gas stations, right? Corner stores, things like that. Whereas people who live in resource communities have a lot more options and tend not to even like consider those jobs as viable jobs for themselves. Last point for this. Average resource community, low rates of run-ins with law enforcement versus in the average under-resourced communities, militarized police presence, and staggering incarceration rates. And if I could get personal again here for a second, I grew up in a middle-class suburban community. In fact, when I was a kid, we used to not lock our front doors, which, seems ridiculous to me, but I never had negative interactions with the police. The police were always nice to me. I mean, sort of. I got pulled over sometimes for speeding, but even then it was like they just gave me a ticket and I just went on with my life. So when I started, interacting and encountering poor people more and hearing their stories and trying to understand what life was like for them, and I would hear all these stories about negative interactions with police, my reaction was like, well, that's ridiculous. Like the police they're the good guys. They help us. They protect us, right? Well, if you live in an under-resourced community, that is often not the case, right? Specifically, if you live in a poor urban area, I think in particular, this is what the police look like. This is how the police are trained to interact with your communities. Particularly kind of in the decades after the war on drugs, there were actually programs where like the CIA and the US military were like giving old military equipment away to urban police forces and training them how to use it in order to combat drugs. But what happens, right, is that when you live in these communities and the police are coming at you with like tactical gear and kind of waging war in your community, you start seeing them as a threat. You start seeing them as a menace and not as something that's there to protect and serve you, right? And here's just some examples of this. So, in 2015, there was a guy named Freddie Gray in Baltimore who was arrested and died while in police custody. And his death sparked a huge multi-day uprising that included both peaceful protests and violent rebellions and destructiveness, right? And this is kind of like really kind of like the second wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, a few years after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida in 2013. Now, at the time Barack Obama was president, more kind of liberal administration, and the U.S. Justice Department ended up investigating the Baltimore City Police Department. And I just want to show you some of the text from their final report, which came out, I think, in like August 2016. Here's, again, just a chunk from like the summary of the report. Here's what they found. The Justice Department announced today that it found reasonable cause to believe that the Baltimore City Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the First and Fourth Amendments of the Constitution, as well as federal anti-discrimination laws. BPD makes stops, searches, and arrests without the required justification, uses enforcement strategies that unlawfully subject African Americans to disproportionate rates of stops, searches, and arrests, uses excessive force, and retaliates against individuals for their constitutionally protected expression. And just so you know, this is not just Baltimore City. This is urban police forces across the country have been accused of this for decades and decades and decades. When Black Lives Matter came along, they were not protesting a new issue. They were protesting an issue that had been around for decades in these communities. The pattern or practice results from systemic deficiencies that have persisted within Baltimore Police Department for many years and has exacerbated community distrust of the police, particularly in the African American community. And again, as like a white person who grew up in the suburbs, who like when I would hear Black people complaining about the cops, I just thought like, well, stop committing crimes, right? I mean, which is, a very dismissive attitude that a lot of people who don't live in these communities have then and now, right? I no longer think that, right? Why? Well, because I've listened, because I've tried to learn, because I've heard story after story after story after story, and I've looked at the data. And the way that we have policed poor communities, in particular poor Black communities, over the past 50, 60 years has had really, really, really detrimental effects on these communities, particularly when it comes to incarceration rates. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but the United States has the largest prison population in the world. The United States has 25% of all of the prisoners in the world, right? And a large part of the reason why is because of the way we started policing Black and brown communities. As you can see, like throughout most of American history, the incarceration rates kind of went up and down, but didn't go up dramatically. That changes in the early 70s and 1980s. As you can see, this number going up and up and up and up and up and up. So that by the time we get to 2008, we have roughly 1.5 million people who are incarcerated, right? Now, let's kind of split this apart by race. So what is this showing? This is showing basically if Black and white people were like 50-50 of the American population, these are the rates kind of over those same years at which Black people are locked up in comparison to white people. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this would take me a very long time to unpack, but let me just say this. Particularly when it comes to things like drug offenses, right? Which was a significant portion of the incarceration rate during this period is because of drug offenses. According to the data, white and Black people sell drugs at roughly the same rates and do drugs at roughly the same rates. Yet Black people are like 4 to 5 times more likely to get arrested and sent to prison for drug crimes than white people, right? So there's something going on here. This is an issue that's too big to deal with here, but let me just say this, that incarceration rates really affect poverty. And in fact, it kind of goes, I can say it the opposite way. Poverty really affects incarceration rates. Poor people are just more likely to get locked up, right? I think another way to put this is in America, we tend to deal with poverty by locking people up, right? Here's just some statistics for that. Long story short, this is showing let's focus on the left side. It's showing men and women, kind of 3 major racial groups in America, right? Black, white, and Hispanic. Regardless of your race, if you are poor, you are much more likely to end up in prison, right? Lots of reasons why. I'm sure most of you can tease out and understand the reasons why, but most of the people in prison are poor. So again, you know, what is my larger point? Poverty is a big problem in America, and poverty has really detrimental effects. And this is one of the reasons why upward mobility is so hard in America, because so many people who are poor do end up in prison at some point. So this next slide is titled "Incarceration, a Generational Curse." What do I mean by that? Well, let's just look at this. I'm basically going to kind of like present to you a graphic in chunks. So let's just start at the top. Of the 1,248,300 people in state prisons nationwide, this is just state prisons, by the way. We do have a federal prison system, although it's much smaller. Roughly 33% had an incarcerated parent. Roughly 69% of the people who are currently incarcerated are parents. Collectively, they are parents to 1.2 million minor children, right? So in other words, locking people up, maybe it makes us safer, right? Maybe it gets criminals off the street, but it also really negatively impacts poor communities, right? Because, well, why? Having an incarcerated parent makes you more likely to be incarcerated yourself. And conversely, being poor really increases the likelihood that your parent will end up in prison at some point.
There's a structural problem in the country that we keep ignoring. We have 2 million people in our jails and prisons, and 1 million of them are African American. Most of them are males, many of them for nonviolent drug offenses. That is a pattern that has overwhelmed the African American community, because we get a whole generation of kids who now have the assumption that they're destined to be in the criminal justice system. What people need to see today is that the next generation of children right now, with the barriers they face, aren't going to be like I was, or like my parents were, or like my grandparents were, a generation better than those who preceded them.
So one kind of final point on this section before we move on a bit. Social structures shape individual choices and cultural patterns in all communities, not just poor urban ones, right? In other words, if you grew up in a community with well-funded schools, relatively low crime rates, high homeownership rates, low levels of homelessness, ample high-paying careers with benefits, and low run-ins with law enforcement, the chances of you making it are just higher, right? You just experience advantages that people in under-resourced communities do not. Again, I'm speaking in generalizations. I'm not saying this applies to every single one of you. Some of you watching this video did grow up poor and made it. Some of you watching this video grew up middle class, but maybe struggled, like maybe had some very, very, very negative and detrimental, harmful things in your life. And I'm not trying to discount those. I'm just making generalizations, right? We should not be surprised that middle income communities tend to do better than lower income communities, and vice versa. We should not be surprised that many kids who grew up in low income communities with underfunded schools, high crime rates, high rentership, high levels of homelessness, scarce jobs, informal economies, and militarized police, staggering incarceration rates. These realities just make it harder to make it, period. And the people who do make it, I think, are amazing people that we should celebrate and respect and learn from and figure out whatever they did, how do we replicate that for other people? So in order to apply all this, I want to do a little thought experiment. I want you to imagine a poor adult. You can give them a name, you can pick their race, their gender, whatever, like just imagine a person. And I'm just going to sketch out some very, very, very broad details of this imaginary person's life. Okay, this person has a high school diploma. They are a single parent. Again, it could be a man or a woman, doesn't matter to me, or non-binary person, whatever. But they have a child. They are a renter in a poor area, and they have a full-time minimum wage job, right? So they are a hardworking person. They're a dedicated parent. They're trying very, 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 very hard. And they come to you one day and they say, hey, can you give me some advice? Now, why an adult is asking a college student for advice, I don't know. But, it's a thought experiment. Just bear with me. The more you talk to this person, you say, okay, well, let's just spend some time together. Let me hear your story. Let me understand your predicament, try to get a better sense of kind of what you're working with, right? Now, this is about to get a little weird, but again, it's a thought experiment. The more you talk to this person, you kind of get this image in your head of this bird that wants to fly, right? I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. This is a little weird, I know, but it's all going to come together. And the more you're talking, you're like, okay, I see that there's this bird, it's almost like a bird in a cage, and this bird is this beautiful thing that wants to fly and thrive. And I'm going to help this person kind of identify their barriers and get around it, right? So the more you talk to this person, the person starts to identify some barriers. Well, for one, I have this low wage job, right? I just have a job that doesn't pay me enough, and it's kind of making it hard for me to move forward. And additionally, the schools in my neighborhood are not that good, right? I have a kid. I want my kid to thrive and do better than I am doing currently. But it's hard because my kid's school is not so great. And you're like, okay, well, these are pretty manageable problems, right? Low wage job. Maybe I can help them get a better job. Failing school. Maybe I can help get the kid into a charter school or something, or, figure out if their school district has some kind of choice system where they can go somewhere else other than the school that they're zoned for. However, the more you talk to this person, right, and the more you kind of zoom out and get the big picture, right, and really get understand the full extent of this person's issues, you realize that there's not just two barriers or even one or even three barriers facing this person. There's a kind of network of interlocking barriers to this person really thriving and pulling themselves out of poverty, right? What could some of those barriers be? Well, maybe they're mental health issues, right? And maybe the person has no health insurance. So again, you see how there's kind of these interlocking barriers, right? On one hand, they have a mental health issue, and maybe they want to get help. Maybe they want to see a counselor or go on medication, but they have a low-income job. They don't have health insurance, right? Or maybe they do have health insurance, but it's really crappy health insurance. It doesn't cover mental health, which a lot of crappy health insurance programs do not. And again, you keep talking to this person and finding out more things, right? You find out that living paycheck to paycheck, right? That again, their low-wage job is just creating kind of endless anxiety and insecurity for them. And, they're just one big bad medical bill away from, losing everything. And in fact, they're currently possibly facing eviction because they're behind on their rent. Why? Well, because they're living paycheck to paycheck. Why? Well, because they have a low paying job. Right. You also find out that they have a family member in prison, right? And the data that someone who has a family member in prison, right, they're more likely for a child in particular to end up in prison as well. And they also have poor social networks. I don't mean poor as bad or negative. I mean poor, literally poor in the sense of poor. All of their friends are poor. Everyone who lives in their neighborhood is poor. Most of their coworkers are poor. Everyone they go to church with is poor, right? And then, well, maybe they do have some friends that are economically successful. And what do? They move out of the neighborhood, right? So you can kind of see this point, right? So the best way to understand poverty is that it's like a bird cage. It's not just one or two or three barriers. It's like a whole kind of network of barriers that all reinforce each other and just make it incredibly difficult for poor people to thrive. And this is one of the reasons why we have such low social mobility, particularly for the very, very, very poor in the United States of America. Okay, that was really sad and depressing. Let's kind of turn our eye now towards solutions, right? There are lots of ideas out there on how people escape poverty. And I think I want to end the lecture by having you kind of examine some of them. So for this last segment, we're going to do something a little different. You probably noticed the video is almost over. It's because I'm going to stop talking very soon and basically have you do an activity kind of outside of the video. So let me explain what that is. Okay, so if you go on Blackboard, it's right on the main Blackboard page. It's not like a separate, it's not like inside of a folder, just it's like a new item on the main Blackboard page. You should see it pretty easily. Basically, it's just a little document with links to 4 different videos. These 4 videos are 4 different perspectives on how people escape poverty and or some of the barriers facing people trying to escape poverty. 2 of them are more kind of right-leaning and 2 of them are more kind of left-leaning. Because again, because everybody agrees poverty is a problem, because everybody agrees that we want less poverty, everybody has an opinion on this, right? And again, I want to expose you to kind of a range or a variety of opinions, okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to watch these 4 videos. As you're watching these 4 videos, you are going to be kind of in your minds working on responses to 2 questions, right? So you're going to post 2 signed responses to the main Lino board, 1 post for each of the questions below. Question 1 is this: imagine you are counseling your poor friend from the birdcage thought experiment. What is one piece of advice you'd give your friend, typo, as they try to escape poverty? Again, you know, maybe you're thinking like, oh, I don't think I'm qualified to give them advice, but it's just a thought experiment. Just pretend. Watch the videos. Identify maybe at least 1 really, really good piece of advice that you think would be helpful to this person. Number 2, so this is kind of like the personal, now we're going to go to the structural. Imagine that you have been given a magical ability, again, thought experiment, to change 1 piece of US policy or legislation. What is the 1 thing you would change about our nation's response to poverty? So maybe this is a new law. Maybe this is the removal of a law or a program. Maybe this is, you know, like changing the tax rates to fund something, you know, like whatever it is. If you could change 1 thing about how America kind of on a national, federal level responds to poverty, what would that thing be? Again, this is our last lecture. I'm looking forward to hearing your responses. And I guess good luck on your exams. Thanks for taking my class. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you thought it was interesting. And, you know, maybe I'll see you around campus. Although if we do, I might not recognize you. So you can say hi to me if you recognize me and I don't recognize you. Thanks. Take care.